The cell door slammed shut with a deafening clang, echoing through the cold, dimly lit corridors of the prison. Inside, a man sat quietly on the edge of his bunk, his broad shoulders casting a shadow against the concrete wall. His name was Marcus Johnson, a name that meant nothing to the guards or the other inmates. To them, he was just another face in the system, another number in a sea of forgotten men. But Marcus was far from ordinary. Beneath his calm exterior lay a past so explosive, so dangerous, that if the Mexican cartel had known who they were dealing with, they might have thought twice before targeting him. It all started with a rumor, whispered in the dark corners of the prison yard. The cartel had eyes and ears everywhere, even behind bars. They were looking for someone to take the fall for a crime they had orchestrated, someone who wouldn't fight back. Marcus, a quiet, unassuming black man, seemed like the perfect pawn. They didn't know that his silence wasn't fear. It was strategy. They didn't know that his calm demeanor masked a storm of training, discipline, and lethal precision. Marcus wasn't just any inmate. He was a former Navy SEAL, a man who had faced death in the most hostile corners of the world and lived to tell the tale. The cartel's plan was simple: frame Marcus for a violent incident inside the prison, ensuring he'd never see the light of day again. What they didn't count on was his ability to turn the tables. Marcus had spent years honing his instincts, learning to read people, and anticipating moves before they were made. He knew something was coming, but he didn't know when or how. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Every glance, every whisper, every shift in the prison's usual rhythm was a clue. And Marcus was paying attention. One night, as the prison lights flickered and the usual hum of voices faded into an eerie silence, Marcus felt it, the shift. He was no longer just an inmate, he was a target. The cartel had made their move, sending a group of enforcers to deliver a message. But as they closed in, Marcus stood tall, his eyes sharp, his body coiled like a spring. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The men approaching him had no idea what they were walking into. They thought they were dealing with an easy mark, a man who would crumble under pressure. They were wrong. As the first blow came, Marcus moved with the precision of a predator. His training kicked in, every movement calculated, every strike deliberate. The fight was swift and brutal, a blur of fists and fury. When it was over, Marcus stood alone, breathing heavily, his knuckles bruised but his spirit unbroken. The cartel's enforcers lay scattered around him, groaning in pain. But this was only the beginning. Marcus knew the cartel wouldn't stop. They would come back harder, stronger, and more determined. And when they did, he would be ready. But there was something else, something deeper that Marcus couldn't shake. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. The cartel had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated him. And now Marcus was no longer just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting to expose the corruption that had put him in this position in the first place. The prison walls that once felt like a cage were now a battlefield, and Marcus was prepared to wage war. As the dust settled and the echoes of the fight faded, Marcus sat back on his bunk, his mind racing. He knew the cartel would retaliate. He knew the stakes were higher than ever. But he also knew one thing for certain. They had no idea who they were messing with. The legend of Marcus Johnson, the Navy SEAL, was about to be reborn. And this time, the world would know his name. The question wasn't whether Marcus could survive. The question was whether the cartel could survive him. And as the lights dimmed and the prison fell into an uneasy silence, one thing was clear. This was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. The night after the fight, the prison was unusually quiet. The usual sounds of clanging metal, distant shouts, and the hum of fluorescent lights seemed muted, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Marcus sat on his bunk, his back against the cold concrete, staring at the ceiling. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one sharper than the last. He replayed the fight in his head, analyzing every move, every mistake, every opportunity. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding the game, and Marcus was a master at games of strategy. He thought back to his days as a Navy SEAL, the grueling training, the missions that pushed him to his limits. He had faced enemies in the deserts of the Middle East, the jungles of South America, and the icy mountains of Afghanistan. But this was different. Here the enemy wasn't just a faceless terrorist or a rogue militia. Here the enemy was a system, a network of corruption that reached far beyond the prison walls. And Marcus knew that to beat it, he would have to play by a different set of rules. The cartel had chosen him for a reason. He wasn't sure what that reason was yet, but he was determined to find out. He had heard whispers of their influence inside the prison, how they controlled the flow of drugs, weapons, and even information. They had eyes everywhere, guards, inmates, even visitors. No one was safe from their reach. And now they had made personal. Marcus wasn't just a target, he was a message, a warning to anyone who dared to cross them. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man to back down. He had spent his entire life fighting against the odds, against the people who underestimated him. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Chicago, he had learned early on that the world wasn't fair. But he had also learned that fairness wasn't what mattered. What mattered was strength, resilience, and the will to keep going, no matter what. And Marcus had that in spades. As the days passed, Marcus began to piece together the puzzle. He started paying closer attention to the other inmates, the guards, the subtle shifts in power dynamics. He noticed how certain men seemed to move freely, how certain favors were exchanged, how certain rules were bent. He saw the fear in the eyes of those who crossed the cartel, the way they would glance over their shoulders, the way they would lower their voices when certain names were mentioned. It was a web of control, and Marcus was determined to find the center. One name kept coming up, El Fantasma, the ghost. No one had ever seen him, but everyone knew he was the one pulling the strings. He was the cartel's inside man, the one who made sure their operations ran smoothly, even behind bars. Some said he was a guard. Others said he was an inmate hiding in plain sight. Whoever he was dangerous. And Marcus knew that if he wanted to take down the cartel, he would have to find El Fantasma, but it wasn't going to be easy. The cartel had already made their move, and Marcus knew they wouldn't stop until he was out of the picture. He had to stay one step ahead, but in a place where trust was a luxury and betrayal was the norm. That was easier said than done. He needed allies, but who could he trust? The inmates were either too scared to help or too loyal to the cartel. The guards were either corrupt or indifferent. Marcus was on his own, or so he thought. One evening, as Marcus was walking back to his cell after dinner, he felt a presence behind him. He turned quickly, his instincts on high alert, only to see a familiar face. It was Carlos, a wiry, sharp-eyed inmate who had been in the prison for as long as Marcus could remember. Carlos was known for keeping to himself, for staying out of trouble. But there was something different about him now. His usual guarded expression was gone, replaced by a look of determination. "We need to talk," Carlos said, his voice low and urgent. Marcus hesitated. He didn't know Carlos well, but he had always seemed like a man who kept his head down. Why was he reaching out now? Was this a trap, or was it an opportunity? "What's on your mind?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone neutral. Carlos glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "I know what you're trying to do," he said, "and I want to help." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Help with what?" "You're going after the cartel," Carlos said. "And you're going to need all the help you can get." Marcus studied Carlos for a moment, trying to read him. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of anger, of desperation. Whatever his reasons, Marcus could tell he was serious. "Why now?" Marcus asked. "Why not just stay out of it?" Carlos's jaw tightened. "Because they took something from me," he said. "Something I can't get back, and I'm tired of being afraid." Marcus nodded slowly. He understood that feeling all too well. Fear was a powerful motivator, but so was revenge. And if Carlos was willing to risk everything to take down the cartel, then maybe he was someone Marcus could work with. "All right," Marcus said. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way. No mistakes, no loose ends." Carlos nodded. "I'm in." As they walked back to their cells, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. He had an ally now, but that also meant he had a liability. Carlos was a wild card, and in a place like this, one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. But Marcus didn't have a choice. The cartel was coming for him, and he couldn't fight them alone. He needed information, resources, and most of all, he needed to find El Fantasma. Whoever he was the key to everything. And Marcus was determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. As he lay in his bunk that night, Marcus's mind raced with possibilities. He thought about Carlos, about the cartel, about the fight that had started it all. He thought about his past, about the choices that had led him here, and he thought about the future, about what he would do when he got out of this place. But for now, all he could do was wait. The cartel would make their next move soon, and Marcus had to be ready. The game was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. And as the prison lights flickered and the night stretched on, one thing was clear: Marcus Johnson was just getting started. The next morning, the prison felt different. The air was heavier, the tension thicker. Marcus could feel it as soon as he stepped out of his cell. The other inmates avoided his gaze, their usual bravado replaced by a nervous silence. Even the guards seemed on edge, their hands resting a little too close to their batons. Marcus knew why. The fight had sent a message, not just to the cartel, but to everyone in the prison. Marcus Johnson wasn't someone to be messed with, but he also knew that respect could only take him so far. The cartel wasn't going to back down, and neither was he. Carlos was waiting for him in the yard, leaning against the chain-link fence with a cigarette dangling from his lips. He nodded as Marcus approached, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. "We need to move fast," Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The cartel's already planning their next move. I overheard some of the guards talking last night. They're bringing in reinforcements." Marcus frowned. "Reinforcements? From where?" "Outside," Carlos said. "They've got connections everywhere. If they can't take you down inside, they'll find another way." Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had expected the cartel to retaliate, but he hadn't anticipated them bringing in outside help. This changed everything. If they had people on the outside, then the prison walls weren't just a barrier. They were a trap. Marcus needed to act fast, but he also needed to be smart. One wrong move, and he'd be playing right into their hands. "We need to find El Fantasma," Marcus said. "He's the key to all of this. If we can take him down, we can cut off the cartel's power inside the prison." Carlos nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Easier said than done. No one knows who he is. He could be anyone, a guard, an inmate, even someone on the outside pulling the strings. But there's one person who might know." "Who?" Marcus asked. "Rico," Carlos said. "He's been here longer than anyone. If anyone knows the cartel's secrets, it's him, but he's not exactly the trusting type." Marcus had heard of Rico. He was a lifer, a man who had been in the prison for decades. He kept to himself, rarely speaking to anyone, but there were rumors that he had once been a high-ranking member of the cartel. If anyone knew about El Fantasma, it was him. But getting him to talk wouldn't be easy. "All right," Marcus said. "We'll start with Rico, but we need to be careful. If the cartel finds out we're asking questions, they'll come after us." Carlos nodded, but before he could say anything, a loud shout echoed across the yard. Marcus turned to see a group of inmates approaching, their faces hard, their eyes locked on him. At the front was a man Marcus recognized, Hector, one of the cartel's enforcers. He was a big man with a scar running down the side of his face and a reputation for violence. Marcus had seen him around before, but they had never crossed paths. "Till now, Johnson," Hector said, his voice dripping with menace. You've got a lot of nerve coming in here and thinking you can take on the cartel. You're nothing but a dead man walking. Marcus stood his ground, his eyes never leaving Hector's. If you've got something to say it. Otherwise, get out of my way. Hector smirked, but there was no humor in his eyes. You think you're tough? You think you can take us on? You're just one man, and in here one man doesn't stand a chance. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew what Hector was trying to do, intimidate him, break him down. But Marcus had faced worse. Much worse. And he wasn't about to back down now. The tension in the yard was palpable, the other inmates watching silently, waiting to see what would happen. Marcus could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the pressure building with every passing second. But he didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. Finally, Hector took a step back, his smirk fading. "This isn't over," he said. "You're a dead man, Johnson. It's only a matter of time." As Hector and his men walked away, Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He knew this was just the beginning. The cartel wasn't going to stop until he was out of the picture, but Marcus wasn't going to make it easy for them. Carlos stepped closer, his voice low. "We need to move fast. If they're bringing in reinforcements, we don't have much time." Marcus nodded, his mind already working on a plan. He needed to find Rico to get the information he needed, but he also needed to be ready for whatever the cartel threw at him next. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for justice, and Marcus wasn't going to stop until he got it. As they walked back to the cell block, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot worse. The cartel was closing in, and time was running out. But Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been caught in the cartel's web, for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been forgotten. And he wasn't going to let them down. The game was far from over and the stakes were higher than ever. But Marcus Johnson was ready, and he wasn't going to stop until he had taken down the cartel, no matter what it took.